So this clip that you're about to see right here, I think is really, really interesting. One of the issues I had with liberals during the Trump era is that they made this tactical mistake, and it's also, I think, just a factual error as well, to try to basically rehabilitate all of the Bush-era Republicans in service of making the point that Trump is uniquely evil and bad and horrible. Now, look, I think it stemmed from a genuine place of trying to correctly assess the dangers of Trump. Like, I think they meant well in doing that. But again, my issue with it is I think it's a strategic mistake, and I also think it's just factually wrong. For us to forget how terrible the Bush-era Republicans were is a rewriting of history that could lead to damaging consequences moving forward, because if you align yourself with these types, well, you just shifted the Overton window much further to the right and made the Democrats much more conservative in the process of trying to say Trump is so bad, Trump is uniquely evil. So again, I want to be clear, that doesn't mean you shouldn't go after Trump. You should. And that doesn't mean that a lot of the claims made against Trump aren't true. Most of them are. But just like you can hold the two thoughts in your mind at the same time, that Trump is horrible, Trump sucks, and also George W. Bush was probably just as bad. And any sort of objective analysis, I think, would come to the conclusion he's just as bad, if not in some ways, worse. There's some ways in which Trump is worse, right? But overall, I think the most accurate way of describing it is like they're equally bad in slightly different ways, although very, very similar overlapping ways as well. So Liz Cheney, who's the new hero of the resistance liberals, she's been running around. She did an interview with Maddow, and they were like, all buddy-buddy with each other. And Liz Cheney was saying, I might do a presidential run to hurt Trump. What's ironic is that I don't think that would happen. I think if she did a presidential run as an independent, I think it would actually help Trump. I think Liz Cheney would get much more Democratic votes than Republican votes at this point in time. Again, not because of anything related to policy. On policy, she's much more aligned with Trump, but because now the fans of Liz Cheney are much more those resistance liberal Democrats who hate Trump and see her as like a hero for standing up to him. Even though, again, she agrees with Trump on 95% of policies. So it would be a horrible idea. I actually think it would help Trump if she ran. I think if she knew that it would help Trump, then she probably wouldn't run, because I believe her and think that she's sincere in despising Trump. But she's got this new book out. She goes on a Stephen Colbert show. Now, I expected this to be, a yuck it up fest where they suck each other off and talk about how great and brave each other are. But to my surprise, Stephen Colbert did much better than that. And he actually pressures her on this sort of basic question that I'm laying out for you, which is like, is it really that Trump's just the unique evil? Or is there something at the core of your party which kind of inevitably led to the likes of Trump getting in office? So let's watch this back and forth and we'll break it down.
The book is Oath and Honor. The guest is Liz Cheney. So as I said before, I've made a few piquant jokes about you and your dad over the years. And I think it is important that even people who agree about a lot of things have to understand that if we're going to have the ability to have these disagreements, as you said, we have to have a country that has a democracy that is not a fascist dictatorship.
And what is it, pecan? I don't know what that means.
Piquant, like a sharp...
it's a very elitist word.
Yes, well... yes. It's not Colbert, it's Colbert.
Right.
I do want to ask one thing, though, and I don't mean this as a partisan question, but I mean it as a real curiosity. There are left-wing dictators, and there are right-wing dictators.
Yeah.
There are communist and socialist dictators who go to any means, and any amount of people have to die or be trampled in order to achieve whatever freedom for the proletariat. And then there are fascist dictators, right-wing dictators, who, in the name of preserving some imagined status quo or some imagined past that needs to be returned to, will go to any lengths, and anyone needs to be trampled or killed in order to achieve that. So I'm not saying that it is the purview of one party. Why do you think, though, for the first time in our nation's history, the Republican Party won that race and got the first fascist dictator who could possibly take office? I'm just curious if you've done any self-examination of your party's leadership over the last 20 years as to why he is not an aberration, but rather an avatar.
That's a good question. Because that main point is true. He's not an aberration. He's actually the logical endpoint of the groundwork that you guys laid for decades and decades and decades.
I think he's an aberration. I think
really?
I think what Donald Trump has done is, first of all, he tapped into a sense among a lot of people in this country that their voice isn't heard. But he then lied to them, and he preyed on their patriotism, and he told them, you know what, I'll speak for you.
But very specifically through things like racism. Like Mexicans are rapists, they're killers, they're here to get us. Like
No,
that's
look, I
that's a
mean,
very racist ideology.
Absolutely. And
Undermining
one
of the media.
one
That's a very fascist thing to
look,
do.
there's no question that he's using a fascist playbook.
Right.
But it's also true right now, if you want to talk about, for example, the disgusting anti-Semitism that is on the rise across this country, the left has a huge problem with anti-Semitism. And what we're seeing on our university campuses, for example,
No, the left is anti-Israel because Israel is slaughtering massive numbers of innocent Palestinians.
Willingness to stand against it. So
I would agree
yes.
that anti-Semitism is a disease that runs across all cultural boundaries, not only in the United States, but across the world.
Right.
But what I mean by, say, undermining the media is
right.
undercutting, sort of like roughing up the referee was a project of the right for the last 20 years, or undermining
I don't
public
agree with you on that.
institutions.
No.
You say that people believe that our public institutions can take the punishment that Trump will give them, and that's why he's not as dangerous as he should be. But I mean, the Republican Party's mantra has been the government is the problem for so many years.
Yeah, but see, it's really important, in my view, that we not sort of slide into saying everything the Republicans have ever done, is somehow the same as what Donald Trump is doing.
I'm not saying everything. I'm saying those are breadcrumbs.
Yeah, but I think you and I are just not going to agree on that. I mean, I think it's.
I know we're not going to agree, but do you understand why I'm asking that question?
Yeah, but I think you should let me answer it.
Go ahead.
No, look, I think that when I stood in front of my colleagues, for example, when they kicked me out of leadership, I said to them, we cannot become the party of anti-Semitism and white supremacy and racism and bigotry. And if you look at the people and the symbolism that the people had who invaded the Capitol on January 6th, they had neo-Nazi insignia. The Confederate flag flew for the first time inside the Capitol on that day. And the Republican Party, maybe what we should say is we can debate about how we got to this point. I think the Republican Party has people who have been in the party have a particular duty to stand against where we are today. And I also think we all have to recognize he's using a fascist playbook. I mean, I don't disagree with what you're saying. He's taking the same steps that we have seen people all around the world take in the past. And the challenge for us as Americans is not to say to ourselves, well, that can never happen here. The people who are claiming that he is, going to unravel the Constitution if he's elected again are catastrophizing. We can't go down that path. We have to understand this is a very real threat. And there'll be a lot of time for us to debate how we got to this place. But right now, we have to stand together as Americans to stop him. That's the most important thing.
I completely agree. And I completely agree. And I think that's one of the reasons why you are perceived with such courage by even the people who don't agree with what the policies you voted for over the years. The fact that you voted for the president 90% of the time. But now when it counts, for the future of our country and the possibility of us having a free and open and small L liberal society, that you're doing the right thing. So I'm not saying that the Republican Party is somehow this irredeemable creature.
It might be.
What I'm saying, the reason I'm asking is that maybe now is not the time to ask the question, but I think there will have to be a time to ask the question, because the Democrats or the liberals have every opportunity to have their own demagogue, why'd you guys get there first was all I was asking.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, certainly, I wish that this weren't the case. There's no question. But I also think it's really important that we not get into a situation where we act as though or think or talk about, suggest that Donald Trump and the threat that he poses is anything other than existential and unique in our history, because it certainly is.
So here's the problem with what she's saying. She's correct that the threat posed by Trump is unique in this respect, that he is the one who basically blew up this notion that we're always going to have a peaceful transition of power, right? Like, he is the only one who has really threatened it to this degree with the fake elector slate, the fraudulent elector slate, the election subversion, basically trying to steal the last election. In that sense, he is quite unique. But here's what she would never acknowledge. In almost every other sense, he is the ideological child of her dad and George W. Bush. Because they came along, and what did they give us? An illegal and offensive war in Iraq, a war in Afghanistan. So that's 2 wars right there already. Countries that didn't attack us at all. Even if you say, hey, we should go after Osama bin Laden after 9/11, it's like, okay, you could have done special forces and taken him out and not have minimum 200,000 innocent civilians dead in Iraq and millions of people displaced in the region. You didn't have to break the region. You didn't have to occupy the region. You didn't have to have this orgy of profiteering from the defense contractors. You didn't have to have any of that. So they brought us illegal wars. They brought us trickle-down economics, which cut taxes for the wealthy, cut taxes for corporations, deregulated the marketplace, which led to the subprime mortgage crisis and the Great Recession. They brought us torture. They brought us a new level and a new degree of disrespecting the international community and international law in front of the entire world. They laid all the groundwork for Trump. And so now Trump comes along and he says, I agree with all of the deregulating, all the cutting taxes for the rich, all the cutting taxes for corporations. I agree with the torture. He would question the illegal wars, but he continued the illegal wars, and he took one step further. And he said, well, do we even really need democracy? I'll just say I won and try to stay in office. And like, look, if you want to get really specific about it, who won the 2000 election? And who ended up president? The media organizations after the 2000 election did a huge analysis of all of the ballots in Florida, and they counted it in all the variety of different ways, including like the dimpled chads and the hanging chads, and they counted it in a way where you keep them all, and they counted them in a way where you exclude them all. And in most of the ways of counting the votes, Al Gore actually won Florida, which means he should have been the president, right? But Bush ended up effectively stealing the election, and Al Gore was like, okay, look, I don't want to do this, but I'll step aside because I don't want to put the country through a constitutional crisis, etc. So even on the, peaceful transition of power thing, it's like your dad and his president, George W. Bush, you're almost there as well, right? So here's the reality of the situation. The Republican Party for decades and decades and decades laid the groundwork for somebody like Trump to come along, and he is the logical endpoint of the direction the party was going. Whereas she makes it seem like, no, he really is an aberration, and he's something totally different from what Dick Cheney was and George W. Bush was. Well, as Colbert points out in this back and forth, she voted with Trump over 90% of the time. So that is also a problem. I'll give her credit for standing against the stealing of an election. Good. And she's one of very few on the elected right-wing side that say that. But that other 90% is also a gigantic problem, man. And there's no reckoning with that. There's no reckoning with that. They act like they're so different from Trump and so special compared to Trump. And it's like, you're over 90% of the way there already. And maybe that's the problem. And even this idea she brings up like, hey man, the bigotry. Like this is unique. This is bad. And it's like, one of the elections that Bush and Cheney ran, I think it was in the midterms, their whole argument was, let's keep the Iraq war going and let's add a constitutional amendment to ban gay marriage. The idea that the bigotry wasn't there is absurd. It's preposterous. You could argue Trump took it to another level. That's probably true. But it was already there. Like the seeds were already there. And like they put the seed in the ground. They watered the seed of extremism. And then when it grows, they're like, oh, I can't believe this seed grew. I'm against this. And it's like, you're not really. You're not really. Again, I don't want to be too harsh because I want to encourage people who are on the right, elected or otherwise, to accurately say, hey, he tried to steal the election. We can't allow that. And he's a genuine authoritarian threat. I think that's all true. And I think it's a degree above, a degree worse than many of the others. But at the same time, it's like, that's not the only part that's objectionable about Trump, right? It's also the things you like about him. It's also the cutting taxes for the rich, cutting taxes for corporations, the deregulating, the putting the justices on the court that overturned Roe versus Wade. She supported that. It's the attempting to coup the government of Venezuela. It's killing the top Iranian commander in the field. It's continuing the war in Iraq. It's increasing drone strikes by over 400%. It's the outsourcing of the jobs and the embrace of Reaganomics, et cetera, et cetera. So ultimately, it's a hollow answer. And this is why I always try to warn liberals and Democrats and leftists, don't, just because you have somebody who concedes on the biggest point, which is the most important point, which is I believe in the peaceful transition of power. It's like, take it for what it is, but also keep your eye on the ball that this is not your ally. Nobody should consider voting for her. You know what I mean? Nobody should support her because it's not, she doesn't agree with you. She just doesn't agree with you overall. And you have to bear that in mind. You have to bear that in mind because she also is dangerous in her own respect. And unfortunately, we see this in the polling, right? Not just about Liz Cheney, but also about now George W. Bush has been rehabilitated, even in the eyes of liberals. there's this thing that happens in politics where it's like, time really does heal all wounds, and people forget what it was like to have George W. Bush as president, for example. And his approval rating went over 50%, even among Democrats, when he had been out of office for a long time. Because they go, oh, they felt like through rose-colored glasses looking in the past, well, at least Bush wasn't as bad as Trump, and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no. We have to have a correct historical record on this thing and remember them as they were. And people tend to not do that, right? They tend to look at the current threat of Trump for what it is, but also downgrade the previous threats. And it's like, don't do that. Don't do that. So she's no hero. I need you to keep that in mind. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop. And watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.